Yes, but I want to still record it, although it's not that important, but we want to have it.
Okay. Okay, good. So it will be on record. So before Yafim introduce our honorable speaker, I would like to introduce the new DEB seminar series. The basic idea behind this series is an observation that in many cases, people tend to prefer policies that impair the long-term outcome. Classical research in behavioral economics addresses this gap by focusing on the initial biases, why people err early on. What this seminar series will try to do is to facilitate research and communication and research that focus on the long-term impact of the new policies. Okay, so that was my introduction for the series. And now, Yafim, it's all the floor is yours to introduce one.
Thanks. So thanks all for coming to our new DEB seminar. It's very exciting to see a lot of people here. Actually, more than 150 people already joined us. So I thank you all for coming. I especially thanks Ori Plonsky, Kineret Todorescu, and Ido Erev for helping organize this seminar. So we plan to hold this seminar at the first Tuesday of each month at 2 p.m. Central European Time. And our next speakers in April will be Katie Milkman from the Wharton University. And on May, we'll have Jerker Denrell from Warwick University. And I just remind you that those of you who want to be added to our mailing list, please add yourself to the link that I will send in the chat or email me directly. And about the seminar, it will proceed as following. So Ralph will speak for about present his presentation for about 40 minutes with only clarification questions by raising your hand or writing them in the chat. And then after that, we will continue with the questions until 3 p.m. And now it's my honor and pleasure to present our first speaker, which is Professor Ralph Hertwig. Ralph is the director of the Center for Adaptive Rationality at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin. He is one of the founding fathers of the decision from experience field. And among others, Ralph has published more than 150, actually close to 200 articles, and received the prestigious Gottfried Wildman Leibniz Prize. I hope I pronounce it kind of correctly. And Ralph, now the floor is yours, and we are looking forward to hear from you.
Well, thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here and to see so many faces and people whom I know very well. It's like really feeling a little bit at home. So thank you for having me. And today I would like to talk about the description, what we call the description experience framework of the psychology of risk. And that is joint work with Dirk Wolff. But before I do so, I thought that I would use the occasion of the seminar, which as one of the labels has the word experience in it, to reflect a little bit on the last 20 years or almost 2 decades, because we are really coming up in terms of the research that got started in the early 2000s on the description experience gap. And the research, I think, got started with basically 3 papers. And the first paper was published by Greg Barron and Ido on, at the time, feedback-based decisions. That was an experience-based design that was incentivizing each single choice in a long sequence of choices. And that was followed by a second paper, which then also had Ido and Greg and Elke and I joined. And we started then the research on what later became known as the sampling paradigm. And then there was a third paper, which also appeared in the same year, 2004, by Elke and Sharoni Shafir and Endless. And there, the idea was to extend that research on the description experience gap also to animal decision-making, which seems very plausible given that animal decision-making is primarily experience-based decision-making and not based on symbolic descriptions of choice options. Now, I think it's fair to say that if we look back the last 2 decades, then as a result of the research on the description experience gap, I think today we have a much richer view of human choice behavior, but interestingly also many open questions. So I think that the research on the description experience gap is not done at all. In fact, I can think, and many other people can think of many real interesting open questions, which is good because it means that this research isn't done yet. But in quite the opposite, I think it has opened up a lot of new avenues. We've also seen a number of new theories that also enrich our understanding of human choice. And last but not least, I think there are also important productive implications of the description experience gap, and I will talk about 2 of those implications. Let me say a word on how much richer I think our understanding of human choice is today than it was, like, say, 20 years ago. In the beginning, when the research on the description experience gap got started, there was this sense that, yeah, it is a phenomenon in human choice that is related to risky gambles. And of course, that's understandable because risky gambles was the Drosophila. That was the warhorse that we all used in order to study that gap. But then over the years, it became clearer that the description experience gap, and that should not come as a surprise because description experience is such a broad category, such a broad distinction, plays a role in all kinds of cognitive tasks. Some of them are also choice tasks, such as intertemporal choice, but also in terms of consumer choice, financial risk-taking, medical judgments and decision-making, or adolescent risk-taking. But more recently, and I find that also fascinating, also in other areas of cognitive tasks, namely categorization, visual search, or causal reasoning. So I think that what we at the time came across, this description experience gap, is actually very fundamental and very powerful in understanding systematic differences in choice and reasoning as a function of the format and as a function of whether people learn or do not necessarily are required to learn in an environment. Now, here's another illustration of how much richer the choice behavior today is than it used to be. That's a paper by Ido and Eyal, Ori, Dorn, and Odet. And what they showed is that in terms of deviations of maximization of utility or expected value, that in experience we often find deviations that go in the opposite direction of those that were found originally in description. Again, we have a much richer understanding, and the reason why we have a richer understanding is also because we have theories that try to model those behaviors. And the model that was presented here is called the Beast, and it tries to bring together various powers that underlie human decision-making and bring it together in one model. And indeed, if you look at other models, you do see that we have a stronger emphasis, not surprisingly, in decision from experience on learning models, even though some people also tried classic utility models to apply to decision from experience. One example is a paper by Leonidas Spiliopoulos, who used the mean variance model, which is also quite interesting because it deals with variance, which becomes much more clearer, and you can perceive it more clearer in experience than in description. But there are also learning models, and let me mention again BEAST, but also the instance-based learning model that Clotilde Gonzalez and Dutt proposed already quite some time ago was a very powerful and interesting modeling framework. Some people also thought about heuristics, but there in that regard, not that much work has happened. Now, let me conclude this little review of the research that we did, or that emerged out of the original research, by pointing to two productive implications of the decision experience gap. And this is, of course, not an exhaustive list at all. There are many others, but those are the ones that kept me thinking over the last number of years. One class of implications are methodological implications. And Over the COVID time, I worked with Thomas Lejaraga and myself on this paper, in which we try to understand a really powerful and interesting schism in our field, namely the schism that emerged in the early 1970s, when Kahneman and Tversky, with their very innovative research on heuristics and biases, overtook the field. And another line of research that was very much experimental and empirical, namely the research on the intuitive statistician, which was started by Ward Edwards and continued by many other people, and led to many, many experiments and empirical papers. When we look at that schism and see that Kahneman and Tversky arrived as, if you will, a much more pessimistic view of human competence and human rationality relative to Ward Edwards and colleagues, then one difference between these two lines of research is a methodological one. And in this paper, what we are able to show is that if you analyze the experiment that were reviewed in this paper by Peterson and Beach in 1967, and it was a large review of over 160 experiments, then you find that this research, which was much more experience-based in terms of sequences of choices, in terms of feedback, in terms also of incentives, etc. And that in contrast to Kahneman and Tversky's research, which was brilliant in its simplicity, often involving one-shot situation, often involving text vignettes, and in a way much more descriptive than the experience-based research by Ward Edwards. And here's another schism, which also can be explained in terms of methodological implications. That's a paper together with Christine Schulze, in which we try to understand why, if you look at animals and young babies, they are often described in terms of amazing statistical reasoning, intuitive reasoning abilities relative to the apparent stupid grown-ups. And that's not our words, that's the word of a famous developmental psychologist. And again, if you think about it, it's not that surprising because babies and chimps are typically studied in terms of experiential paradigms, and the grown-ups are often studied in terms of descriptive paradigms. Now, important point here is not to say that one research is more important than the other, or one provides the more accurate picture of human competence and rationality than the other. The point is we need to bring that together if we want to get and arrive at a complete understanding of our competences and of our rationality. And also, to some extent, what I'm asking us to do is to bring back learning opportunities in our study of human cognition. Because I think only then we get a full and complete understanding of how good or bad our reasoning abilities are. Okay, and with that, let me come to the second implication, and that does indeed bring us to the field of risk perception and risk-taking behavior. Now, that's a photo that I've used often in my talks on the description experience gap, and it's the starting point of my presentation. And what's great today is that I will stick with the theme of risk-taking behavior because that's going to be the topic for the rest of the talk. What you see here is the only still active volcano in the vicinity of a metropolitan area. The area is Naples, and what you see is the Vesuve, which is the volcano in the background. Now, what has always puzzled people, observers, is that people have decided to actually settle at the foot of this mountain. And this behavior is so puzzling because it is in contrast to public regulations to some extent. And it's also in contrast to the warning of many volcanologists who have expressed serious concern about those settlements and in general have warned of the pending eruption of this volcano. And here an observer from the New York Times suggested that in the shadow of the Vesuvius, those residents have cultivated a remarkable over-optimism, or we would possibly call it overconfidence, and a form of denial as deep as the Earth's molten core. Now, yes, indeed, you may recruit such explanatory concepts, but maybe there's another one which is more interesting, and that's this one. And that's a photo taken in 1944 of Allied planes of the last eruption of the Vesuvius, which was in 1944. And what that suggests to you that the large majority of people who live now in Naples have never personally experienced the eruption of the volcano. They, of course, hear the warnings, but the personal experience is totally different. The personal experience is that you can live there for days and weeks and months and years and nothing happens. Now, this story that I often told at the beginning of my talks is a hypothetical story. It's a hypothetical explanation for how people behave the way they are. We are now a little bit further, and I brought along this article here, which concerns a volcanologist who was interviewed after the eruption of the volcano on the Canary Island La Palma, which happened this year. And she's also being asked about people to the extent to which people were aware that this could happen. I would love to read the text to you, but I can't because I have all the photos of you guys in front of me. So I can make it smaller. Here we go. If you read the text, then it says, in a Canary Island, the feeling is that people have very little historical memory of what an eruption is. And we are going to return to that notion of historical memory because I think it's important. The vast majority are not aware that there are active volcanic islands. The last terrestrial eruption was on La Palma in 1971. And on this island, you find people who say that there are no recent eruptions. Only those who suffered them directly mention them. Sometimes these things have to happen for people to remember where they live. You have to be aware of the risk you take living here. Now, some of you may think that I'm obsessed with volcanoes, so let me give you a different example, which also illustrates how important personal experience of risks is. And this has something to do with floods. What you see here is a photo of the German city of Passau. And Passau is interesting because it is a city, what you see here is the old city, and you see basically three rivers, two from the right, and the greener one, which is the Danube, in the middle coming together right at the top of the old city, which on a beautiful day looks like that because the waters actually have different colors amazingly, and it looks spectacular. But unfortunately, sometimes it looks like that. And this is a photo of the last flood in 2013. And just to give you an illustration, if you see these two houses here, the pink one and the yellow one, you see them here again. So what typically happens on a flood like that is that the whole old city is more or less underwater, at least the lower quarters of it are underwater. Now, if you walk around in Passau, then you see at the city hall, basically the historical record of these floods. And I like this record so much because it also illustrates one more thing. It illustrates that these floods do happen, but they are rare. They often happen once or twice per century. And that brings us back again to that notion of historical memory, to which we return later. Now, I also want to point out that Dirk and I, when we wrote this paper, actually we wrote it during the Corona pandemic, we were, of course, not the first ones who thought about that. There was a really very innovative paper and cool paper by Eldad, Greg Barron, and Ido, going back to 2005, where they also thought about the role of personal experience in contributing to different patterns of response to rare terrorist attacks. And what they were thinking of at the time is whether with the description experience gap, they could potentially explain these different responses of international travelers and people living in Israel to the second Intifada, which started toward the end, I think, of 2000. And what you see is that what did change as a result of the Intifada was the drop in the inbound travel, so people coming from abroad staying in Israel, relative to the domestic traveling within Israel. So in other words, the tourists responded much more stronger than people living in Israel. And one potential explanation for that is that people in Israel, even though they are, of course, aware of the risk of terrorist attacks, they also experience that they are rare, they are not frequent. Relative to people coming from abroad, which only have the newspaper warnings, but they don't have any personal experience that tells them how rare or not rare these events are. Another paper that inspired us very much is a paper by Greg Barron, Stephen Leider, and Jennifer Steck, who also wrote a paper that's totally worth reading and important in 2008. And they were talking about the interplay of descriptive warnings and safe experiences. And that one potential reason why warnings don't work is because people often have safe experience undermining the warnings. I wanted to point these two papers because we basically didn't start from scratch. We were really also relying on this research. Now, here's the paper that we wrote over the pandemic, and the starting point was this premise here that's underlined, namely that we distinguish between two powerful but imperfect teachers of risk, namely the teacher in terms of experience and the imperfect teacher in terms of description. Now, and the core of the paper is essentially a simple fourfold table, and like all fourfold tables, it's simplistic, but I do think that this simplicity has some very nice features and has great heuristic value. And I hope you agree with me. So what we assumed is that in principle, we can distinguish between four epistemic states in which a person may find him or herself. And these epistemic states are described through the absence or presence of description and the absence of the presence of experience. And the first cell here is one in which descriptions are present. You see here, for instance, a typical fact box where people are told about risks, such as, for instance, an MMR vaccine. MMR vaccine is the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine that is being administered in many countries of the world. So you have a description, but you haven't gotten the vaccine yet. So personal experience is absent. But then you have also a cell where you have both. You have a description, a descriptive warning, or other health statistics or other descriptive information narratives. And yet you also have the personal experience of the vaccination itself. And it could be either you or it could be the doctor who has personal experience. You have also a situation where you have only the experience, and you have a situation where you have neither experience nor description. Think, for instance, back to the very beginning of the Corona crisis, which perhaps was a situation where we neither had description, we neither had statistics, nor did we have any personal experience with it. And then that raises the interesting question, how do people deal with the risk in those situations? Now, here's just to give you an idea, and now let us walk through those four cells, and we start with the description only cell. And let's think about what kind of prediction would we expect. And the first prediction in that particular cell is that if we start with the description experience research, that rare risks will, ceteris paribus, loom larger than they should. And that is basically the idea of cumulative prospect theory and the overweighting of rare events. Now, let's think about what would that mean for descriptive warnings. And here's a very typical descriptive communication. It's, as I told you, it's called a fact box, and the fact box, and it's in German here, tells you about the risk of this vaccination of the MMR vaccine, and you're being informed about the benefit, which is called Nutzen, and the harm, the Schaden, in terms of the best empirical and scientific evidence there is. Now, if we take that serious that the rare risks loom larger than they should, then what that could mean is that we have the problem that paradoxically, through our warnings, we may create or help to create, I'm not arguing that this is the decisive factor, but it could contribute to that. We could amplify vaccine hesitancy. In other words, by explicitly describing the threat of potential harm of the MMR vaccine, and here's an example of how we describe that in that fact box, we are basically highlighting a very rare risk. And in the paper with Ido, we have identified, or we have presented at the time, or proposed at the time, a possible explanation for why the mere mentioning of an event could increase its subjective probability or its subjective weight. That is actually suggested by a lot of similar findings in psychology that does suggest that by bringing an event into the world, simply by describing it, it becomes in the perception of people more liking through the mere act of presenting it. Now, vaccine hesitancy is, of course, a very undesirable behavior, but interestingly, you could also think of situations where the mere presentation effect or the overweighting of rare risks could work the other way around, where it actually means something positive or has positive behavioral consequences. Think, for instance, of the explicit description of the threat of secondhand smoke and its risks, and one of its major risks is lung cancer. Now, this is a rare event, lung cancer. In fact, we found here the number that in 7,300 lung cancer deaths in the United States each year are traceable to secondhand smoke. This is a relatively rare event if you take into account that approximately 58 million people are exposed to secondhand smoke between 2013 and 2014. And yet, by presenting this rare event, here you may have a desirable behavioral consequence, namely that people get deterred either from smoking or tell other people, their family members, that they should definitely quit smoking or stop smoking because of the risk of secondhand smoke. So in other words, in a description-only cell, if you take the description experience difference seriously, you should expect that rare risks may possibly loom larger than they should. And this can have undesirable consequences, but it can also have desirable consequences. Now, let's look at the second cell, which has only experience. So you don't have any description, but you only have your personal experience. What would we expect in that cell? Now, different things. The first straightforward prediction would be that we should expect that people tend to underweight rare events. That has been found oftentimes over in the description experience literature. And let me give you an illustration of that, and that makes it clear why indeed you may expect rare events to be underweighted. If you think back to the measles, mumps, and rubella shot, and think about given how rare it is, how often does a doctor have to administer that vaccine in order to experience once with certainty the rare event? We calculated that here, and basically the doctor, he or she, has to administer nearly 25,000 times the vaccine in order to experience once with certainty the rare event. And if you just are interested at the probability of 50%, several thousand times the doctor has to administer it. And looked at that way, it is not too surprising that people in their experience may underweight a rare event, such as these very rare side effects of vaccination. But in the experience-only cell, it's not just the underweighting of rare events that you should expect. Interestingly, there are also circumstances in which you should expect the opposite, namely an as-if overweighting of rare events. And here I point you to the research on a hot stove effect by Jorke Denrell and Jim March. And it's basically the idea that a powerful experience of negative sort may really turn you away forever from that kind of behavior. So it's basically, metaphorically speaking, the cat who steps on the hot stove burns its paws and never touches the stove again. And that is akin to overweighting of rare events. Now, we also found very interesting the whole idea of an experiential refractory period. And that's related to what Owe and others have described in terms of the wavy recency effect, namely the idea that if an event happens, a consequential event, then the psychological impact of the event will fade with time, and that will lead to a different different impact of the event, a different weighing pattern of the event. And last but not least, another phenomenon that is also consistent with the idea of overweighting of rare events is the depression baby hypothesis. And that's research that goes back to Ulrike Malmendier and Nagel. And they, studying the 20s and 30s of the last century, found, and they were studying US citizens, they found that people who lived through a macroeconomic shock, and at the time they were looking exactly at the 20s and 30s, they then later take fewer financial risks in their lives than other people who didn't live through that period. So in other words, you see a lower stock market participation. Again, akin with the idea of as if underweighting of rare events. What's interesting, of course, is to ask the question, what other crises, such as, for instance, if you think about the 2008 crisis, or if you think about the corona pandemic, what that will do with our appetite for risk or our risk preference, if you take that as a starting point. Now, let me give you one more example of the depression baby hypothesis. That's research that Thomas Lejarvaga and myself and Jan Voigt and myself did a number of years ago. And here we brought the depression baby hypothesis into the laboratory. And basically what you see are 4 conditions, experimental conditions. And what you also see is basically what we set up was a digital investment stock market, and people in each round had to decide how much they invested in their stocks. And they went through the experience of a shock. And by the way, what people here were exposed to was the Spanish stock market between 1999 and 2013, but it was anonymized, so they didn't know that they were looking at the Spanish stock market. In one condition, they started out with the shock experience, that's the red line. In a yellow one, they started with a lack of a shock experience, but they experienced basically a rising stock market. And in a shock description and no shock description, they didn't experience these shock experiences or no shock experience, but they were only told about that in description. And what you see here is basically the behavior that resulted. And what you see is that if people actually experience the original shock, then as a result, as investors, they were much less likely to take risks in their investments relative to those investors who didn't experience the shock. And that difference in the experience condition, which was much more pronounced than relative to the description conditions, where people also learned about the past shock and the lack of shock, but where this description has had much less of an impact on their resulting behavior. So again, this is an indication that experience matters enormously and can matter and has quite different systematic implications for behavior than description can have. So that's the second cell, where we only have experience and where we basically, depending on what the circumstances are, should expect overweighting of rare events or maybe recency effects, or where we should expect underweighting of rare events. What about the third cell, where we have both description, warnings, and other things, as well as our personal experience? Now, what is interesting here, and a key question that we should think about and more think about it, how do they get integrated? And is it possible that one overrules the other? Now, the research on description experience, there are a number of studies, not that many, but a number of studies that seem to suggest that in the long run, the experience seems to overrule the descriptive warning. And that's interesting because this could be one potential explanation why it is so hard to change human behavior with warnings, descriptive warnings. In fact, that's runs through the whole theme of research on warnings, that they often don't work the way they are supposed to and are not as powerful with time as we want them to be. And the idea here is that the reason could be that the experience of safe encounters can really thwart a warning's ability to shape behavior. Think, for instance, of sexually transmitted diseases. And look at these numbers here. In 2018, there were 10.8 cases of syphilis per 100,000 people in the US. Now, assuming that one would need to come into direct contact with a syphilis sore just once to then become infected, that's a strong assumption, one would need to have sex with over 6,000 people to reach a 50% probability of contracting syphilis. And what that means is that if a person is being warned about a sexually transmitted disease, but has already had many experiences of unsafe sex, then he or she may conclude that, well, I'm not convinced because, I mean, my experience tells me something very different. Or take a situation where the warning comes in time, the person hasn't had yet safe experiences, but for whatever reason, he or she is not protecting himself, and again, will go through many experiences that seem to suggest that this is safe behavior. So the whole idea of the interplay of description experience is a very powerful research question. And here, the timing of the warning and the kind of experiences that we have, I think may help us to explain why people often respond to warnings in such a, at first sight, such paradoxical ways. And with that, let me go to the fourth one, to the fourth cell, where we neither have experienced nor description. And let me just say here that this is a very interesting cell. I don't think the description experience gap has much to say about that cell, at least not for the time being. But here you can, of course, assume that people would, for instance, rely on their mental models or come up with causal explanations, and on the basis of those, try to predict what kind of risks and how large the risks are that they are experiencing. But this is a wide open field that needs more research. Now, let's assume that we start with that framework. The reason why I think it's an interesting framework is because it raises a number of new questions and new research themes that are really interesting to pursue, at least in my view. Let me give you a few examples. The first one comes under the label of chercher l'expérience. So let's think about what experience does. And the first notion here is asymmetry experience. And what I mean with that is that if we think about expert lay people discrepancy in risk perception, which are very frequent, then we should always ask the question, how is experience being distributed across these two parties? Is the expert the person who has the experience, like the doctor giving many vaccinations? Or is it actually the patient or the lay person who is actually much more experienced? Think, for instance, of the person living close to the volcano. You could argue here the person living close to the volcano, relative to the volcanologist, is the expert in terms of experience, not in terms of the statistics, but in terms of the experience. So if we want to understand the expert lay people discrepancies, we need to ask the question, how is the experience and how is the description being distributed across these two parties? There's also the question of accumulation of experience. And with that, I mean this. Now, this is real world data coming from the UK, where you basically see the risk of dying from lung cancer as a result of smoking as a function of the years you have smoked or of your age. And basically what you see that in the initial stage of smoking and non-smoking, there's hardly any difference. I mean, the non-smoker has the same risk of dying from lung cancer than the smoker. In the middle stage, you see that the risk now starts to diverge, but the real difference occurs later in life. And that's also interesting because what it means is that experience is indeed an incomplete teacher of risk, because very often the real risks, the harmful effects of our behavior only occur with some time delay. And that we have to take into account when we also need to, when we try to communicate risks to people. And the third issue that I find very interesting is the question of the dynamic nature of experience. And with that, let me go back to that notion of the collective or historical memory of risk events. And what we try to do here is the following. We try to think about what's the half-life of a risk experience. And there's a little bit of research in the literature, not much, but we could draw upon some interesting papers. So for instance, there is the finding that people who are involved in a car collision, their behavior, their driving behavior will be changed for a period of about 3 months to 3 years. After 3 years latest, they revert back to the pre-collision driving behavior, and it becomes again more risk-taking. If we think about a macroeconomic shock, then Ulrike Malmendir's research seems to suggest that its lasting psychological impact is about a generation. If we think about floods and the experience of a flood, then there's a wonderful article going back 2 years that seems to suggest it takes about 1 to 2 generations before people move back into that very territory where their house or the family's house was destroyed through a flood. So in other words, if we think about how experience affects us, we need to think about the, if you will, the half-life of these risk experiences and get a better sense of how long is their lasting impact on our behavior. A second implication is that if we think about description experience, or that framework that I suggested, is then we can also think about different ways of communicating risks to people. And I'm particularly fascinated by the idea of simulated experience and to what extent it can enrich risk communication. The first paper that I'm aware of that is led by Kaufman, Weber, and Hazley, which I found very innovative and interesting. They went back to the description experience work that we did, and they thought that we can use that, or they can use that in order to tell people in a descriptive or in an experiential sampling approach about the risk of investing in the stock market. What you see on the left side is basically a description-based approach where people are told what happens when they invest in fund A or B. And you see they are being told about the expected return. They are also being told about the volatility or the variance in the possible returns. On the right side, and now that needs to be animated, people could also get a sense of the variance by looking at return distribution that builds up with time. So you have like possible returns that are distributing and leading to that kind of distribution that you see here, but it's animated and you get a real sense of the volatility. And what these authors then find is that people in the experience sampling condition take more risk, they invest more in a risky option, which from the German point of view was a good thing because Germans tend to be invested in the stock market. But on top of that, participants also said they felt better informed, and they also suggested that their judgments of the probability of a loss is more accurate. Let me give you one more example where we made use of this distinction between description and simulated experience. We recently did an RCT of 300 German patients with chronic non-cancer pain. And what's often being prescribed in those patients is strong opioids, but that should only be used for a very small period. And the problem is, in Germany, but also of course in the US, that people continue to take that for a much longer time. And what we did is that we gave information descriptive warnings, or not informed them in a descriptive format that you are familiar with right now, namely in terms of these fact boxes. But on top of that, we also informed them in a simulated experience format. And let me see whether that works here. So people basically saw a simulation and they could then see what happens if they take the opioid over a longer period of a month or 2 months. And they could see what kind of positive effects, but also what kind of negative effects accumulate over time. Now, what we then found was this. If we are interested in how good or bad people are able to estimate the opioids' benefits and harms, it's clear that the fact box is better than the simulation condition. And that's not surprising because the fact box tells you exactly in numerical terms what the likelihoods of benefits and harms are. So the fact box is good in terms of telling people what the risks are. Now, in terms of the subjective risk perception, what we found is that after the intervention, and you have to look to the right side, the likelihood that people thought that the harms somewhat outweighed the benefits or clearly outweighed the benefit hugely increased as a function of both the fact box and the simulation. So people after the intervention were much more aware that there is a big risk of taking opioids. But here comes the thing that surprised us most. When we returned to them 9 months later, then the people who received the simulation, experienced simulation, showed a much greater reduction in termination of the opioid intake. And they, with a larger likelihood, took up alternative therapies. Now, I'm not able to tell you why that is. We can only speculate. But it was really fascinating to see that the simulation seems to have a stronger impact on the actual behavior. It's certainly not better in terms of people getting a realistic understanding of the risk, but in terms of changing the behavior, the simulation was more powerful than the fact box. Now, what I showed you were basically simulations of the probabilistic structure, but you could also have
Just to say, formally we have 15 minutes left.
Okay, I'm done in 1 minute or 3 minutes.
Thanks.
We have also another example of a simulation that is not in terms of probabilities, but in terms of impact. And let me give you just, I came across this video and was quite fascinated by it, just so that you get a sense of an impact simulation.
Especially if you can see that tornado, now is not the time to grab that smartphone and start filming. Instead, it's time to get inside and seek shelter. You run inside to seek shelter from the storm and come up to your bedroom, which normally is pretty safe, until of course a tree crashes through your roof. Coming down to a lower level, great idea. Trying to see where the storm is outside those windows. It was a good idea to leave the windows, but this exterior wall doesn't help you as much as you might think. No, tree limbs or 2x4s, they're like toothpicks when winds get as fierce as in these storms. Yes, your garage is on ground level and has 4 sides. No, it isn't going to protect you the way you want it to. So this is where you do want to be. Not only a low level, but the lowest level you've got. And you want to put as many walls between you and the storm as possible. And then you stay here until it's safe. Because this room could be the one thing that saves your life.
Okay, this is of course very spectacular, but it gives you the idea that sometimes we don't necessarily want to simulate probabilities or frequencies, but we want to simulate the impact. And we can do that in ways. We can do that in different ways than through descriptions, but we can simulate the experience. And with that, let me come to the last page and quickly summarize. So what I propose to you is that we may be thinking in new ways about risk behavior and risk communication and risk perception by taking a description experience framework. And if we do so, we can distinguish between 4 epistemic states, and they give rise to distinct predictions for risk perception and risk-taking behavior. I think I like this framework because it has heuristic value. It implies new questions and offers new explanations for otherwise puzzling behaviors. So, for instance, we can explain expert lay people discrepancy not necessarily as irrationalities, but perhaps as different distributions of descriptive and experiential knowledge. We better understand why risk warnings may be often toothless, because they may have to counter rich experience that tells people that things are not as dangerous as they seem to be. We can also explain naivete with risks when, for instance, our experience tells you that this is all very safe, but also our overreactions to risks. If we don't have any experience, but we only have rare events described, then we tend to overweight them. And last but not least, another interesting question is the whole topic of how long does historical memory of risks last and sway our behavior. And last but not least, I think that with that framework, we can also start thinking about new ways of communicating risks. And I think I find the idea of simulating probabilistic textures, but also the impact of events, in particular with all the new tools that we have, virtual reality, gamification, augmented reality, earthquake simulators. I find that really, really interesting. And I think in a way we need to really reinvent the way we communicate risks and not only think about descriptive, but also experiential ways of communicating risks. And with that, I stop here and look very much forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the excellent talk. And now we open the floor for questions. So please raise your hand or just unmute yourself. Yes, Thomas.
So I enjoyed that, Ralph. Thank you very much. But I wonder, you talked about in the beginning of your talk, the risk of floods in Passau. And then later you talked about it takes about 3 generations for people to move back. So is the old city of Passau now empty?
Good point. No, it's not. There is one problem. I mean, the reason why I was so fascinated in Passau is because it has been pointed out that people take too few protections, and also that people are not buying enough flood insurance. But you are right, people are living in that area. Now, the difference to the original study that I was suggesting it takes 1 to 2 generations, or they were suggesting it takes 1 to 2 generations, is this is the destruction of a whole village, where a whole village is wiped out by a flood, and later on you couldn't live there, and then people moved away, and then after 1 to 2 generations came back to that very site. Now that's different in Passau, because as of now in Passau, people were immediately able to move back because the houses were still in place. They needed to be renovated. So in that sense, I think we have to be careful to quickly generalize between these different historical analogs. But I find the general question, what is the half-life of these experiences, both on an individual level, but also on a collective level, I find a very interesting one. And I would love to see more research on that question.
Thanks.
There is a question from the chat. How much of the experience effect is due to its sequential nature, so that sequential descriptions would act like experience? This is from Josh Clayman.
Well, first of all, I'm not quite sure how descriptive sequences look like. I mean, I'm sure that there are very different ways of doing that, and they may have different effects. But in principle, that goes back to a paper that Thomas Lejaraga and Robin Hogarth and myself wrote a number of years ago, in which we try to come up with a classification of what we called the qualia of experience, or the psychological dimensions of experience. And I think that is also one of these big questions that I think is still unresolved, namely, what exactly does experience do? Is experience about the probabilistic texture of the world? Is experience about the affective dimensions? Is experience more about things that I can touch or not touch? Things that are, is experience so convincing because it's authentic? I myself have experienced it, so I know it's credible and I can rely on it. And what are the differences to description? Why? What are the qualia of description? And in that paper with Robin, and I just see Robin in front of me, which is wonderful, that we try to come up with a classification and speculation, but this was just the first step. I think that is also something that needs much more research, to think about what exactly is it about experience that is so different relative to description, and what are the strengths in terms of conveying psychological dimensions in terms of description. For instance, description, of course, is wonderful in terms of conveying the experience of others. That's really one of its great strengths, and that's much harder in personal experience. We typically it's harder to convey what other people experience in the same situation without symbolic descriptions. So there are pros and cons for either one, and we at the time made just a first attempt to understand how they are different. So in other words, I'm not able to answer that question because we first need to understand what the key dimensions of description experience are.
Thank you. Priya.
Thank you for that. So, so I'm doing some work related to this in the way that, so in psychology, there is this idea of dual process theory. That's more in cognitive psychology, where there is this duality of feeling and thinking, or affective and cognitive. So here in this description experience gap, I also see that where description is more cognitive and your experience is more feelings or affect. And that you can you feel the feelings, so you can actually relate it to yourself, whereas the text is a little less of feelings, it is just knowledge. So, and these are two systems that operate in the mind. So I was trying to relate to that, and there so I would like to hear your views on that, and also the on this theory of risk as feelings. I think that is an early theory by George Loewenstein. And so we relate what you have told us to this feelings versus thinking, or the affective versus cognitive aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I know that this is a very popular distinction in psychology. I personally don't find it that informative. I would also not think that description necessarily is more associated with the second system, because think about description. I mean, one of the great strengths of descriptions is that we can convey very powerful emotional narratives that also appeal to our affects and our emotions. And at the same time, you can very analytically analyze your experience. You can look back at your experience and do that in a very systematic, analytical way. You can even experiment with your own experience, and you could see, how do I feel in situation X or Y? In this sense, I don't think that I would find that system 1, system 2 distinction a mapping on the description experience distinction the way I have talked about it. And I myself have concerns about how easily it can be generalized to that distinction.
So, okay, just to follow up on that. So in that, actually, we are on the same page. I also do not agree with the system 1, system 2 perspective. However, the idea I'm bringing up now is with regard to experience as or feelings through the amygdala-based system. That is the part of the brain which engages in the feelings, versus the other part, which is the description, is more on the cortex, and that is related to the cognitive processing. So this is not system 1, system 2. Either systems can do affective and cognitive, but that difference exists. This is more just on the use of feeling versus the use of analytical thinking. So if you experience and then use it in an analytical manner, then it goes back to cognitive. If you have a description and you feel something, as we saw in some of the results you presented, if you feel based on experience, then it is, of course, it's a feeling, and it probably stays with you longer. So that was the distinction I was pointing out.
Okay, thank you. I think we are on the same page.
Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. So now the time is up. So we currently stopping the seminar, but Ralph agreed to stay a bit longer to answer questions. So those of you who want to stay with us for about 10 to 15 minutes more are welcome to stay. And those who have to go, thank you for coming. This was very interesting. And we hope to see you in the next seminar. So, August.
Yes, thank you for an interesting talk, Ralph. I was wondering on this, when you end up in a kind of continuum, I mean, when you use description to kind of, for someone to feed their experience forward, you can do that in a written material where someone writes about something on a kind of meta level, or you can have them talk about their experience. So the typical example would be in Swedish schools, we have Holocaust survivors talking about their experience, and that's of course very engaging, and the idea is to have a greater impact than people just reading about this horrific event. But you know, on any research, if it actually works in that way, that it works as experience, that we weigh the risks differently in that case? And is it kind of on a continuum, so you're in the middle between description experience in that case, or
I mean, I think that is something that is almost, and I'm sorry that I didn't spell that out, it's almost understood that, of course, the description experience, like all dichotomies, is wrong. It's profound.
Of course.
But like there are lots of false models that are very productive, and I think this false dichotomy is productive. And of course, in reality, when we think about description experience, we are thinking about a continuum. And of course, there are descriptive information that are closer to the original experience. Think, for instance, of the research, and I see Ulrich Hofhag in front of me. Think of the research on natural frequencies relative to probabilities. That would be a nice example. And of course, if you think about narratives relative to statistics, you may be even closer to the original experience. Now, I'm sure that people have thought about that and probably also researched that, to what extent we can use narratives in order to convey risks. But I personally have to say I'm not aware of that research. But I have to say I didn't follow it up at the time. So all the people who are doing risk research may vary. I mean, maybe say, of course, the research X, Y, Z, but I couldn't tell you. I do have concerns, or not concerns. I have reservations as to how good it is, to how good narratives can replace your original experience. I mean, I can easily. I mean, think for instance, I mean, to give you a very current example, think of the example of COVID-19 and ending up in an intensive care unit and being, for instance, inhaled with 40 or 50 liters of oxygen every minute. Now, I can tell you probably about that in a very powerful narrative, but reading about that and actually experiencing it is probably two very different things. And in that sense, I would expect that, yes, of course, you can move descriptive portrayals closer to the original experience, but I also would think that there are limitations to that.
Yeah, and I agree, because what I'm thinking about is that there is also another difference in the classic experience description, whereas the description is kind of the meta level, 2 out of 10,000, whereas the experience is actually the one case, so to speak. And in this kind of experience description, you're talking about the one case rather than talking about the statistics.
Which, by the way, is an interesting dimension that we haven't opened up yet, but it's also totally worth thinking about it, in the sense that description experience often means experience of the individual.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be that way. You can also think, of course, of collective experiences, and then you can think about what does collective experience, how does that relate to the description of collective experience, which, as far as I can tell, is a question that we haven't yet even started thinking about. And that goes back to what I said originally, that even after 2 decades of research on the description experience gap, for me, there are more open questions. I find it even more interesting than I used to find it 20 years ago.
Yeah. Thank you.
This is exciting. Ori Plonsky.
Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot for a great talk, Ralph. One thing that I think I missed maybe is how you think of learning from description versus learning from experience. Are these two different cognitive processes in your mind? Are these fundamentally different cognitive processes?
Yes, I mean, I at least would think so. I mean, to give you an example, and that goes actually back to Ryle, famous philosopher. And so if I can tell you in much detail, die Leiden des jungen Werthers, whoever came up with that, that's yes. But even that, I would say that the description of the experience of being in love and being rejected is not the same as actually experiencing it. And I think we probably all experienced it once, and we probably read about it. So sorry, this was a comment on a comment that I just saw. Die Leiden des jungen Werthers, The Suffering of the Young Werther, which was a book by Goethe, which was a very powerful description of being in love and being rejected by the loved one. Wait, now I lost my thought. What did you ask me? Oh, so yes, whether these are to learning. Now, Ryle would say that I can tell you in much detail, in a very fine descriptive detail, how to ride a bike. But you will still not be able to ride that bike once you step onto the bike. Now, in order to learn how to ride the bike, you have to ride the bike. Now, that may be a very extreme example. I can easily think of examples where the experiential learning strategy and the descriptive learning strategy may be closer together. But I do think that there are a lot of activities, in particular also motoric activities, that you simply cannot learn through experience. You actually need to learn it, to experience it and actually to learn it. So in that sense, there may be an overlapping set of learning strategies that are boosting both, but there also may be very different ones that only apply to one or the other. That would be my best answer at this point.
The reason I'm asking is that you mentioned the mere presentation effect for learning from in the description only quadrant, and it seems to me that this has a lot to do with how we learn from experience as well, right? So the fact that it's there, it reminds us something, and it's the same as reminding us of past experiences. So it seemed like you're saying it's this kind of the same cognitive process, but now you're saying it's not. So I'm not sure how you would think of that.
Yeah, good point. I haven't thought about that. What I would say is that what is so powerful in experience is actually the lack of experience. So what I thought was very interesting for all these rare consequential events, it is that we are not that we are engaging behavior and we are not experiencing the occurrence of the risk. And that, of course, is different in description, where independent of our experience, the rare event is being described and therefore takes on its own reality, or can take on its own reality. In that sense, may deserve more thinking about what that actually means, the mere presentation effect for description, for experience. There may be two mere presentation effects.
Ulrich.
Yeah, I have a question, Ralph.
Sure.
Have you thought about the relationship between experience description, framework, and sampling? So the background of the question is the following. Typically, when people make experience, they have some control over their experience. They can control where they go. And when it comes to description, someone else did the sampling. So one issue is, are these people really similar to me? And the other, how has this data set been selected? And control and trust is maybe then also a related issue.
Yeah, I think that's a very important idea. And again, another of these questions that we haven't sufficiently explored and thought about. I think you're right. I mean, sampling is so powerful because the question here is, who does the sampling? Does the environment do the sampling? Are we the masters of sampling? Now, there is, of course, some research in a sampling paradigm, that's work that Dirk did, where he was comparing sampling procedures in which people had full control over the sampling process, and sampling procedures where, for instance, people only had limited control. For instance, they could determine, they could not determine when to stop, but they were told you have to sample up to 10 times, for instance. So it wasn't up to them to end the sampling. And what you find, and what Dirk then found, is that, for instance, the recency effect, which is a frequent effect in the sequence-related decision-making, the recency effect is very much a function of whether or not people have control over the sampling process. So in that sense, I do think that the sampling process itself, and who is the master of the sampling in terms of how much do I sample and when do I stop sampling and how do I sample, is another great question that we have started thinking a little bit about it, but I mean, there's lots of new questions that deserve to be studied here, which again, I'm repeating myself. I think that after 20 years, we have more open question, and interesting open question. That's so fascinating. They are not just like on the side, but they are going to the core of human experience. I think that's what I would argue. And that's why it's so fascinating.
Agreed. Thank you.
Sveta? I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Sveta Saraf? Okay, maybe not. So I will read the question from the chat. Jackie is asking, has any research looked at the effective evoking description versus cognitive evoking descriptions?
I'm not sure that I understand the question, but what I can say is that there's at least one paper that I'm aware of, that's by Renato Frey, who asked the question, and it goes a little bit also in Uli's direction, to what extent strong affects under which we are in a particular situation may affect our sampling behavior. And that is interesting because that question actually goes back to Darwin. If you think about Darwin and think about his facial expression of emotions, and for instance, if you are under the state of fear, you open up your eyes and you are taking in, that was Darwin's idea, you are taking in as much information as possible. You're monitoring your environment. So if we take that seriously, the Darwinian hypothesis, then you would suggest that if people are under a state of negative emotions, they should sample more because they need to monitor the world because the world is potentially dangerous. And Renato actually found that he had a really cool idea. So he was studying people's sampling behavior in the sampling paradigm while being in a stand-up comedian show, positive effects, while being in the waiting room of the dentist, very negative effects. And that did affect the sampling behavior quite a bit. So, but that's the only paper I know of how affects itself affect the sampling process, which in itself is another, I'm not going to repeat myself over again, another wide open field, totally worth studying more and in more detail.
Hi, Ralph. Am I audible to you now? This is Shweta Saraf.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you, Shweta.
Yeah. So maybe you have considered this, but I was doing some research on values and choices. So we found some variables as kind of mediating, moderating, just like control mechanism, whether it is about locus of control or whether it is about self-control mechanism. To take action means in risk perception, to take the risk or not to take the risk, as well as information processing, as well as motivational affordances. So motivational affordances is whether you are able to afford your motivations, whether you are able to afford your value orientations. So I am having some risk perception, but am I able to process the information properly? Do I have access to the correct information? What is the channel of information? How much I have faith in that information? So a lot of information processing things are going on. Then your control mechanism, who is controlling your risk perception, internal locus of control, external locus of control, what is your self-control mechanism? We had a lot of time means worrying on these factors, and somehow means we are not able to find out ways in order to collect proper data to understand what are the factors which impact a person from risk perception to whether to take the risk or not to take the risk, to go or not go, means to do or not do that situation. Maybe you have considered it, but just means I was seeking for some help.
Okay, so what I can say about that, and let me also make that very clear, what we proposed at the time was really the attempt to think about description experience, and only that, on risk perception, risk taking behavior, and risk warnings. Now, that doesn't exclude, and I should make that very clear, that doesn't exclude, of course, that these are the only variables that feed into our risk-taking behavior or risk perception. I'm sure there are many others, including, we have, for instance, in that paper, we haven't talked about affects, we haven't talked about motivations. But the interesting thing is that I thought that with just the research on description experience and the main behavioral regularities that have been identified in that research, we already get an incredibly rich and powerful view of risk-taking behavior with all kinds of apparent discrepancies and inconsistencies in behavior. But interestingly, only through those regularities, you can get a pretty good first account of why people behave the way they are without taking emotions and without taking affects into account. Now, that doesn't mean that they are not playing a role or that you do not need them. I don't want to say that. I just we wanted to show that with a relatively simple fourfold pattern, really it's only that we can, and using the research of the description experience gap, we can already come up with a really rich picture of human decision making under risk. And I think that's the point of the paper. We need not necessarily make it more complex in order to understand major behavior and behavioral patterns. But again, I don't want, of course, stop anybody from making it more complex and from increasing the explanatory power of such a framework.
You're correct. Means actually we did a text analysis paper on COVID. So how did newspaper writings influence people behavior, COVID behavior? So we found out that newspapers have included a lot of words like fear, disgust, and those things. And that actually impacted people's perception. Means reading those words also impacted people's perception. And they did not go for funerals of their very close ones because of those fear, disgust words.
Well, that I guess would be consistent with something like overweighing of rare events or the cell where we don't have experience. We haven't gone to funerals and in a pandemic world, so we only can go on descriptions, and under descriptions we may be inclined to overweight rare events. So I find that, so it's interesting to me. And perhaps there's a possible explanation for it. But again, I'm not claiming here that we can explain everything and anything in the world. Only that it's a first really, it has a lot of heuristic value, that framework.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, but we have, I'm sorry, but we have to.
Thank you for your reply. That's it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was an excellent presentation. We were very happy to have Ralph here. So I thank everyone for coming, and especially Ralph for this excellent talk. And we really hope to see you all in our next meeting in 1 month on the 1st of April, which is not sorry, on the 1st of March. And this is not a joke. Thank you, Ralph. We will send you the questions that are in the chat, which we had no time to answer. Thank you again, and we will post the recorded video. And see you all next time.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me and for a really interesting discussion. Thank you so much, and it was wonderful to see so many familiar faces. Thank you for being here.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Prof. See ya.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Ralph. It was really nice.
Okay.